At Çatalhöyük, people buried their deceased loved ones beneath their homes. But some graves were reopened years later. Skulls were taken out. They were painted. Some were even given new faces. But why? 9,000 years ago, why were some skulls taken out again years after they were buried? 9,000 years ago, between 7,100 and 5,950 BC, Çatalhöyük was one of the largest settlements in Anatolia. Thousands of people lived in houses built side by side from mud brick. The houses were so tightly packed that there were almost no streets. People entered their homes through openings in the roofs. But the living were not the only ones inside these houses. There were graves beneath the floors. Bodies had been placed inside narrow pits in the earth, with their limbs drawn up close to the body. Adults, children, babies. Some had been buried alone. Others were placed in the same spot again and again over time. While people continued living in their homes, the dead were also laid to rest beneath those same houses. People cooked, slept, and raised their children above them. Only a thin layer of earth separated everyday life from the remains of the dead. But in some of these graves, something far more unusual had taken place. Some graves were opened again years later. The bodies were no longer exactly where they had first been placed. Some of the bones had been removed, and the remains in certain graves had been moved to different places. In other words, some of these people had been taken from their graves years after burial and moved elsewhere. The skulls, in particular, appear to have been treated differently from the other bones. Some skulls had been placed beside other people. Others were found in the fill inside houses and in different parts of the buildings. This was one of the clearest signs that the dead were not simply buried and forgotten. Human remains were moved over time, taken to different places, and sometimes placed back into the earth. So why were the skulls treated differently? The answer becomes clearer when we look at some of the unusual skulls found at Çatalhöyük. During excavations, archaeologists discovered that the skulls of some skeletons were missing. Some skulls had been separated from the body along with the lower jaw and the vertebrae of the neck. This may have happened after the body had already been buried, because examination of the bones suggests that the removal may have taken place after the soft tissues had disappeared. In some graves, small openings had also been made later, apparently to reach the skull. These openings suggest that some skulls may have been deliberately removed. The evidence suggests that the skulls of at least 12 and possibly as many as 15 people were deliberately taken out. Adults, adolescents, and even one child. But not all of the removed skulls were treated in the same way. People living at Çatalhöyük placed some skulls beside other people. They moved some skulls to different places. And among them was a very unusual skull whose face had been reshaped and covered with red pigment. So why did these people treat certain skulls in such a way? One of the most remarkable examples was found in a grave discovered in 2004. A woman who was over 50 years old, held against her chest in her arms, was a skull. But this was no ordinary skull. The skull had been covered with plaster. The eye sockets had been filled, the nose had been shaped, and the features of the face had been recreated. Red ochre had been applied to its surface. Even more striking were traces showing that parts of the plaster had been repaired or reapplied. There were also traces suggesting that the paint had been renewed. These traces suggest that the skull was not simply prepared and placed in the ground. It may have been kept above ground for some time, worked on again, and then buried once more. So why were people recreating the faces of the dead? And why did the skull seem to carry such special meaning? But the special attention given to the human head at Çatalhöyük was not unique to this place in Neolithic Anatolia. Hundreds of kilometers to the southeast, at Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists also found remarkable evidence connected to human heads and skulls. Some skulls had deliberately made grooves and cuts. Others showed holes and traces of red ochre. And human heads appeared not only as real skulls, but also in carvings and depictions on the stones of Göbekli Tepe. Headless human figures, statues carrying human heads. These discoveries come from different periods and different communities, so we cannot say that they all came from the same belief. Yet when we look at the skulls from Çatalhöyük, one thing becomes clear. Not every skull was treated in the same way. Some were removed, some were painted, some were reshaped, and some were placed beside other bodies. So what determined these different treatments? This is one of the most remarkable plastered skulls known from Anatolia. A similar practice was more common in places such as Jericho and Ain Ghazal in the Levant. The skulls of the dead were removed. Their faces were reshaped with plaster and then buried again. But at Çatalhöyük, this practice was quite rare. Most skulls were left plain. Some were painted only with red pigment. Red ochre was one of the most commonly used materials. Some male skulls also show traces of cinnabar, a bright red mineral. This red mineral appears as a stripe across the forehead on some examples. In some cases, it was found together with plant remains. Whether it was connected to a headband or applied directly to the skull is still unknown. So why were only certain skulls chosen? We do not know. There is also no clear pattern based on age or sex. But some skulls were clearly taken out again and moved to different places. They were later placed back into the ground, sometimes beside another body. Yet the meaning behind all these actions remains unknown. Perhaps what mattered at Çatalhöyük was not so much who the skull belonged to, but what happened to it after death. Because for some of the dead, the process did not end with burial. Their skulls were removed again, their faces were changed, and then they were placed beneath the houses once more. This suggests that at Çatalhöyük, death and everyday life were not completely separate. The dead were placed in the earth, but they were not completely removed from the world of the living. Perhaps the skull continued to preserve the person's presence, memory, and identity. The recreation of a face with plaster was one of the clearest examples of this connection. But we still do not know why it was done. At Çatalhöyük, a house was more than simply a place where people lived. Paintings on the walls, bullheads, and traces of pigments. All of these suggest that people gave their homes meanings that went beyond everyday life. Placing the dead beneath the houses was also an important part of that life. Some researchers believe that burying the dead beneath the home may have been connected to maintaining a bond between the family and its past. The bones of ancestors may have served as reminders of the family's history and its connection to the home. But we cannot say for certain that this was the reason. Some graves of babies and young children were also placed close to the walls or near the edges of the buildings. Why they were placed there is also unknown. Perhaps it was connected to the house itself, or perhaps it had something to do with the meaning given to the dead. All of this points to the same thing. At Çatalhöyük, the dead were not completely separated from the world of the living. But even today, we still do not know exactly why. Perhaps the most striking part was that this closeness did not last forever. As time passed, the place of the dead began to change. The world shared by the living and the dead under the same roof eventually came to an end. So when did the dead leave the homes? At that time, Çatalhöyük had no separate cemetery. People buried their dead relatives inside the homes where they lived. During the Neolithic period, people were doing this not only at Çatalhöyük, but also in different parts of Anatolia and the Near East. Çatalhöyük, Archaeological, and Boncukluhöyük, Jericho and Ain Ghazal. In these places too, the living and the dead were found together inside the same homes. But over time, this way of life began to change. As time passed at Çatalhöyük, graves inside the houses almost completely disappeared. Human remains began to move away from the living spaces. Toward the end of the New Stone Age, the dead began to be buried on the edges of settlements or completely outside them. This change continued into the following Chalcolithic Age. Similar changes were also taking place in Mesopotamia, the Levant, and different parts of Anatolia. Graves inside houses became less common, and separate places for the dead began to be used. It was not only the location of the graves that was changing. The distance between the living and the dead was changing too. So why did this distance appear? Why did death move away from the home? Some researchers believe that as communities grew and homes and families became more independent, the connection between ancestors and the home may have weakened. Others believe that separating everyday life from the places where the dead were kept reflects a gradual change in the way people understood their connection with death. There is no definite answer. 9,000 years have passed. We can no longer know exactly what the people of Çatalhöyük were thinking, but the traces they left behind are still here. Perhaps the answer was hidden in this closeness between life and death. At Çatalhöyük, people did not take those who had died away from their homes. Instead, they kept them beneath the places where they lived. Perhaps the purpose was not to forget the dead, but to keep them as part of the family and the history of the home. The fact that some skulls were removed again years later may also suggest that this connection continued. Of course, we cannot know the true reason with certainty. But perhaps for the people of Çatalhöyük, death did not mean that a person had completely disappeared. Perhaps even after death, that person remained part of the home and the family. If you enjoy discovering mysterious chapters of history and uncovering the secrets left behind by the past, don't forget to subscribe to Chasing the Truth. And if you enjoyed the video, leave a like and share your thoughts with us in the comments, because sometimes the past tells us much more than just the answers.